Latest technology, the CD-ROM computer. This is a multimedia system.
Welcome back to IAB Canada's Business of Digital Audio series. This series is an extension to our audio committee, whereby our focus is on exploring the world of audio and the role it plays in the overall digital marketing and advertising media mix right here in Canada. My name is Laura Ferron, Head of Membership and Strategic Partnerships with IAB Canada, and I am joined by our co-host, Karim Kanji, VP of Digital and Emerging Media at Active International. Karim, you're also the co-chair of our audio committee, so it's great to have you here. And I'm rather curious, as a buyer and a podcaster yourself, what role do you think audio plays in the media space?
Hi, Laura. Wow, that's a great question. I have to be honest and upfront. I come from the podcasting space first. I have been podcasting in one form or another, or on one program or another since 2010. Which was just before I got started in this crazy world of advertising.
So
So
you started podcasting before.
yeah, so I'm a fan
Interesting.
of podcasting. I'm a fan of audio. I remember promising my dad that I would never watch TV again and just listen to CBC radio. That lasted a whole 24 hours when I was a kid, but from that day, the reason I remember that day is because that's, I think, the day I fell in love with audio. So I'm a fan of audio. So I come from that perspective. But also as on the media side, on the planning, and then on the buying side, on the strategy side, I think that audio holds a special place. And I'll sort of give two reasons why I think that's true. Number one, whenever we hear about the second screen, we hear it from the perspective of video, specifically television. When people are watching television, there's a second screen involved, which is their phones in most cases. So people's attention, and I want to focus on that word attention, is split between multiple screens. When it comes to audio, we rarely hear about a second screen when it comes to audio. Now, I will admit that we hear including audio in various activities. I was on a call earlier today talking about podcasting, and someone said people listen to podcasts when they're walking the dog, when they're doing the dishes, when they're doing another activity, rather than someone sitting down with a cup of coffee or tea and just listening to a podcast. However, people are paying attention to podcasts, and I'm really excited to speak to our guest today, Jeff Vidler from Signal Hill, because he is someone that over the past number of years has been studying the habits of Canadian podcast listeners. And listeners are paying attention when they're listening to podcasts. And the reason that companies advertise on podcasts is because Canadians specifically are taking action when they hear a podcast. They're researching that brand or that product on places like Google. They're going on social and interacting. They're talking to somebody about that product or that brand. They're visiting a website, and the holy grail is that they're going somewhere and purchasing that product. So I'm a fan of this space, and I think it works when it comes to media.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's such a nice intro to Jeff, but also so indicative of my own behavior of, out walking, my dog.
Yeah.
And then, how many products I have since invested in because of being exposed to him in the podcast.
How many mattresses do you now own, Laura?
Far too many to count. Thank you. Today, we are fortunate enough to sit down with Jeff Vidler, president and founder at Signal Hill Insights. Jeff, such a warm welcome to you. I think if you can, for the sake of our listeners, I'm really curious if you could tell us a little bit about your role, especially as it relates to the audio space.
Great. I've been working in the audio space for a long time, longer than I probably care to admit. But a lot of that work was in radio, working in radio, but also doing radio research. But over the last 7-8 years, really, it's been very much focused on podcasting. Our company, Signal Hill Insights, which we launched 4 years ago, is focused on podcasting. We still do a little bit of radio research, but we saw the opportunity for podcasting very clear. The growth of podcast listening, the growth of podcast advertising. So we do a lot of work on advertising effectiveness work, mostly in the US. But we also do a study in partnership with Ulster Media called the Canadian Podcast Listener, which is heading into its 8th year. We did the first one back in 2017, and it's really provided that kind of landscape view of podcasting in Canada. We have a number of subscribers, sponsors who help support that to bring information to advertisers, to publishers, to agencies, just to keep them up to date, educate them on what's happening within that sort of growing podcast listening audience.
Jeff, thanks again for coming on. I have, I guess, a simple question. Maybe it's not simple, but maybe this is part of the research that you do with the Canadian Podcast Listener Survey. What are the key reasons that Canadians are listening to podcasts? And I'm curious if you've seen or sensed a difference in how they engage with podcasts versus other types of online media.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, podcasting is really unique in a few ways. I mean, really the 3 reasons that people tell us they listen to podcasting are to learn something new. Curiosity is a big part of that. Hear interesting stories, the whole notion around storytelling. And also, I mean, this is more of a blanket statement, but to be entertained, which I suppose that is similar across other media for the most part.
Yeah.
But beyond there, that sort of curious to learn something need, and the nature of audio itself really creates this kind of immersive environment when you're listening to a podcast, which does make it different from all, particularly when you're looking at most of the other kinds of online content. Probably the best example is we ask listeners who listen to news podcasts, and that's one of the larger categories. What is it that separates news coverage that you listen to on podcasts to newspapers, to online news, to social media, to TV news? And there's 2 things that really stand out as being different and really kind of marks the space for podcasting and podcast listening. And that is personal connection, and that goes to that intimacy of the medium, and depth. The ability to go deeper. Other news media, convenient, immediate.
Yeah.
That's not really podcasting strength. Podcasting does come at it from a different angle. So, and even what kind of podcast they want to hear. They aren't interested in hearing headlines on a podcast. They want to hear in depth, and that can take a number of different forms. But they, it does speak to just that difference between podcasting and other media. Just using that one category as an example.
Hearing those interesting stories.
That's very interesting, Jeff. And I guess along with that and the why people are attracted to podcasts is why brands are attracted to podcasts and participating in them, whether it's a branded podcast that a brand might have or even advertising. And I'm curious from that perspective, what makes podcasting different from other mediums online when it comes to reaching and engaging with audiences?
Again, it goes back to that intimate, immersive nature, I think, to a large extent. What has really proven itself to be very successful since, podcast advertising began, and I mean, in any kind of scale, that would be, say, in the last 10 years, has been the host read ad.
Yeah.
And it really ties that personal connection we talked about earlier when it comes to news, and that immersive quality. People do care about those hosts. There's a parasocial relationship there that brands can take advantage of. That it's a very human thing, which makes it very unlike other kinds of digital or online content. This is not clicks. This is people, right? And speaking in that way to them. So, there's the other thing too, which is unique about podcasting, and it has to do with that sense of connection to the podcast itself, is that listeners do value the support that sponsors give to their favorite podcast. So a sponsored podcast is one of those, if they really believe that this ad is, part of what, makes this podcast available to them, they value that in a way that, you would see in other media. You see it often in ethnic media, or you see it in gay media, or you see it in other kinds of specialized media. But you do see that, you have 25% of Canadian podcast listeners say that they make a point of supporting brands that support their content, that support their podcast.
That is a great number. 25% support. That is amazing. So I want to build off of that, Jeff.
Sure.
So I would think, going to any planner, buyer, or brand and saying 25% of people that listen to this are going to support your brand if you show up, on a podcast. However, what are some of the, generally, what are some of the unique advantages of advertising on podcasts? Is it cost? Engagement, conversion is something relatively new. I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And some of that, is still kind of unknown. That's one of the things that's kind of fun about doing research about podcasting, is we still are uncovering things all the time about what makes podcasting effective or how it could be more effective. But probably the best testament to the strength of podcast advertising, one of the reasons why it fetches such a high cost per thousand, is, back in the days when there was virtually no measurement of podcasting, and that again goes back, say, 8 to 10 years ago, brands would, again, make a relationship with a host, have the host read the spot, and would use a promo code at the back end of the spot, or even if it was a pre-recorded thing, have a promo code at the back, because they had no way to measure it. This was one way they could see how effective it was, and it had proven itself to be very effective, and it has proven itself over the years to be a very effective lower funnel. For example, compared to radio you're listening to when you're out and about, you're driving in the car, things like that, when you may not be able to immediately go to that website to buy that product. But a podcast, so most podcast listening takes place at home, and people have their phone right there with them, and they can go ahead and do that if they want to. So that podcasting as an advertising medium has really proven itself out on that lower funnel. But probably the best example is BetterHelp. I don't know if they're not as big an advertiser in Canada as they are in the US, but in the US, there's the number one advertiser for the last 3 or 4 years, spending $8 million a month on podcast advertising.
Wow.
And almost all of it is done by host reads, hosts telling their story, and then connecting that to BetterHelp and how BetterHelp can help. So, it is that really kind of cornerstone of podcast advertising to date.
Yeah. I want to talk about that host reads for a second, because I think there's such a, to your mention of that intimacy piece, right? That authenticity that comes through in that host read, if it resonates, right? And the ability for that ad to really resonate with the audience. And then, Jeff, you also spoke about this piece of, perhaps being in the home and listening to a podcast, and then having access to another device, this sort of extension, this device extension that takes place in that scenario specifically. But also, I'm curious, within the research, do you look at kind of the consumer journey, or where a listener is most likely to be tuning into a podcast at all?
We do ask, I mean, in terms of activities of where they are when they're listening. Yes, we do, absolutely. A lot of it is, and it really speaks to, I guess, the benefit that podcasting brings to listeners is that it works really well when your eyes are busy but your mind is free. So if you're, we just finished actually, just a study just came out of field that we did, this is one in the US, but, asking people what activities they do while they listen to podcasts, and housekeeping was the number one. It kind of takes the drudgery out of those daily tasks. And because you have time to be engaged, your mind is, it's like, oh my God, this is boring. And, you're looking for something, and music just doesn't do the job in the same way.
Right.
A focus group, but this is probably 6 or 7 years ago. One of the things that first sort of cued me into just how powerful podcasting can be. It was a house painter, a millennial house painter, and they're painting inside of houses 8 hours a day, flip flop with a brush. And he said, I would go crazy if I didn't have podcasts to listen to. He said, now sometimes by the end of the day, I'll turn on music then. But, he listens, and the podcasts he listens to are podcasts that are 5 hours long. I mean, because that's how much time he has to listen to podcasts. But it does speak to just that one thing that is unique about podcasts, that you can really sink yourself into something, engage yourself with something when you're otherwise, your mind is, in sort of stalled.
And then I'm also thinking about the brand alignment to that activity as well, and the opportunity that really creatively exists in that.
Yeah, Swiffer, Away. These are things that should be advertising on podcasts, especially on weekends when people might be cleaning their house.
Right. Here, Karim and I were just talking about, maybe being out walking our dogs,
Right.
Yeah.
How expansive these activities are for that brand integration.
But that's again another use that people have for taking that dog walking. It's hard to really have that conversation with your dog, but you can be engaged in something that you're listening to, right?
This part of the conversation reminds me of that song in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Whistle While You Work. I'm wondering if they did a reboot, it would be the dwarves would be listening to podcasts while they worked.
That's the planner in you.
I know, eh?
they weren't white collar workers. I think it was kind of like house painting would be their job during the day, right? Their mind was not necessarily engaged.
Jeff, go ahead, Karim.
No, Laura, you first.
Well, Jeff, I'm curious, with the study kind of in field for so many years, which is also, what terrific news that it continues. Has anything surprised you over the years with the research that you're seeing?
I mean, it is always changing. So there's always some new things we discovered because we never asked the question before. Nobody asked that question before, or other things that are just changing in the marketplace. So, as podcast listening has grown, and it's grown by, monthly podcast listening has grown by more than 50% since we started, Canadian Podcast Listener.
Wow.
But it's also mainstreamed a bit, right? It was, if we go back to 7 or 8 years ago, it was focused on major urban centers. It was, and I mean, it still indexes quite high for university education, but not quite as much as it used to. Now a little bit more across the country. In fact, by province now, there's really only a couple of percentage points difference in terms of monthly podcast listeners across the country. The exception being French Canada, which still lags behind English Canada, but really more than anything else, that's just a function of a lack of content. Although that content is growing, and as that content's growing, so is the podcast listening growing in French Canada.
Good to know. Good to know. Jeff, so I want to sort of end off with this question. You talked about, 50% growth since you started doing the study, now seeing podcasts as something that is mainstream across Canada. I'm wondering if you are seeing any emerging trends or best practices, specifically when it comes to podcast advertising. And maybe, what should brands be considering when they're looking at podcasts as a medium?
I mean, that's a great question. I think there's sort of two things that as you say, as podcasting becomes more mainstream, as the idea of building reach within podcasting becomes a reality. We have now
Okay.
almost 40% of Canadians, adults, listen to podcasts at least once a month. And that percent is growing by a couple of percent a year, in effect. So you're getting to the point where we're almost at critical mass with podcasting as a medium, where its reach among 18 to 34-year-olds is very close to like linear television, right? In terms of how many listeners you can reach. Then you've got so many podcasts. There are a few hit podcasts. They have relatively small audiences, but even you get kind of outside of the top 10 podcasts, and really it's very small. We do a survey of 1,600 listeners a year. We're typically getting 2,500 different podcasts identified as podcasts that they're listening to. When we ask them just to name up to 10 podcasts they've listened to in the past month, and most people say 3. So think that we have 2,800 different podcasts. So it's as advertisers are looking for reach within podcasting, they have to develop other strategies than just the host read, because you can't talk to 1,000 podcasts and get to those hosts and have them give them the copy points, have them read the ad, have feedback on the ad they've read. That's what BetterHelp does in the US, and they have a team that does it, but they still don't have that kind of reach. And how manual that is, and how much effort that is, and that's done directly by the client. That's not the agency that's doing it, because agencies don't have that kind of extra time to be doing that. So, how do you scale podcast advertising? And there's a few things that have been tried. We did some research last year. My partner, actually, Paul Rismondell, did in the US, where you can take a campaign that you do host reads where that's practical. Then you can do sort of in that same category or genre or general audience, you can maybe have what they call a talent read, which is effectively an endorsement by somebody else. But somebody who would be well known to that podcast audience. So you're still getting some of that same value. It may not be that host, but you're still getting the sense of somebody human talking to you, in that intimate way about the brand. And then also an announcer read that, which can be sometimes very effective as well. That helps to round out that. So you can programmatically put in the talent reads and the announcer reads, but then still do the hands-on work on some of the key podcasts that would be part of that network, right? So really understanding how to get that scale is part of it. I think the other thing too is we know how effective podcasting is as an advertising medium at the lower funnel, but its ability for brand building hasn't been fully explored yet. And I think that's one of the areas that we look to as in terms of ad effectiveness, to be able to do surveys, brand lift surveys, and things like that, to understand what is that campaign doing in terms of awareness, favorability. Branded podcasts you touched on as well. I mean, the opportunity for brands to have their own podcasts, engaging listeners in a deep way for episode after episode after episode, even with a very light brand touch, can have really powerful effect. So we do studies on that, but it's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing to measure in that sense as well, because they aren't typically large reach podcasts. They're relatively small, but they have a lot of deep engagement.
Right. Oh, Jeff, I feel like I have so many more questions and I could talk to you for a lot longer. I'll ask one last question. Maybe this is where we should have started, but it's okay because it's been so fascinating, at least in my opinion, nonetheless. Tell us about the size of podcasts in Canada. What does the space actually look like from what you see in the data? What's the Canadian podcasting, what's its size in Canada?
Well, I mean, I'd say there's almost 40% of all adult Canadians say they listen to podcasts in the past month, nearly 30% at least once a week. So that's one measure of size. Another measure of size is just the share of audio that's now going to podcasts. So, podcasts, if you compare all types of audio, including ones that aren't ad supported, people's own personal music or whatever, we're up to what we're measuring now is about 8 to almost 10% share going to podcasting. I mean, radio still has more reach, a larger audience, but again, we look at the younger demographics. You've got podcasting taking a significant share of ad-supported listening, more than the share that goes to ad-supported streaming, for example, right? We're at that point now. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, Laura.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I just think it like helps kind of put it in context for the listeners, like how big the space actually is.
Yeah, it's getting bigger.
Yeah.
It's already notable, and it's getting more notable all the time.
Right. Jeff,
Jeff,
thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. This
Oh,
has been
thanks.
very insightful.
Oh, no, enjoyed the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we look forward to inviting you back.
Okay, it's a deal. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, Jeff.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.